The air in my clinic tastes of ozone and sterile efficiency. It's a flavor I've cultivated, a testament to the seamless intersection of flesh and machine that pays for this subterranean sanctuary. The client on my operating slab, a mid-level data broker named Cygnus, lets out a breathy sigh of pure, unadulterated awe. His eyes, now enhanced by the Ythar sensory filter I've just grafted to his C1 vertebra, are wide with a kind of religious reverence. I can see the data streams in the walls," he whispers, his head lolling to the side. "I can hear the light." I ignore him, my attention fixed on the microscopic sutures closing the incision at the base of his skull. The magnifiers in my optical implant paint the scene in crisp, clinical detail. Each pull of the needle, each perfect knot in the polymer thread. Flesh is just meat. A messy, inefficient medium that people pay me a small fortune to improve. They call me a ripper doc, a butcher. I prefer artist, but mostly I just see myself as a pragmatist. Synesthesia is a common initial response, I state, my voice flat, amplified by the room's acoustics. Your neural pathways are remapping. It will stabilize within a cycle. I retract the surgical arms into their sealing ports and peel off my gloves with a practiced snap. The payment. Cygnus, still lost in his newfound sensory wonderland, fumbles with the cred chip on the tray beside him. He doesn't even look at the amount as he authorizes the transfer. Another fool chasing transcendence in a vial, thinking a sliver of black market biotech will elevate them above the grime of Neo-Kyoto. The confirmation chime is a far more satisfying sound than his spiritual babbling. Final aftercare instructions are on the datapad, I say, already turning my back to him, initiating the sterilization sequence for the operating bay. Purple UV light bathes the chrome, and the high-frequency hum of the sonic cleanser begins its work. Do not interface with any high-bandwidth networks for 12 hours, and avoid unlicensed neural stimulants. I am not responsible for mods that have been improperly maintained. He just grunts in response, slowly pulling himself into a sitting position. He's already an afterthought, another closed file in a long string of transactions that keep my filters clean and my vault secure. I watch his silhouette on the security monitor as he navigates the outer decontamination chamber, and the iris door cycles shut behind him. Alone again. The sterile silence settles back into place, a comfortable shroud. Hours bleed into one another. I run diagnostics, catalog new inventory from a void smuggler, and recalibrate the laser scalpel. The work is my only real companion. It is precise, logical, and it never asks for anything more than my skill. It's a perfect, closed system. My system. Then, a sound that doesn't belong, a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the clinic's outer blast door. It's not the polite chime of a scheduled client. It's desperate. A security alert flashes on my main console, forced entry override. Before I can even arm the defenses, there's a groan of tortured metal, and the multi-ton door grinds open a few inches, its locking bolts screaming in protest. A figure stumbles through the gap and collapses onto my pristine, polished floor. I recognize the jacket, the chrome-laced boots. It's Rain, a client from 2 weeks ago. He's pale, his skin slick with a sweat that seems to catch the light in a sickly, unnatural way. He convulses on the floor, a low gurgle escaping his lips. As I step closer, my stomach clenches. His skin isn't just pale, it's becoming translucent. Beneath the surface, his veins are pulsing, not with red, but with a faint, internal, bioluminescent light, like a deep-sea creature dragged into the crushing pressures of the surface. He looks up at me, his eyes wide with a terror that has no name. And then, his body begins to thrash. My mind clicks into a familiar diagnostic mode, a cascade of clinical possibilities. Rejection, allergic reaction to the stabilization gel, neural feedback loop. These are known variables, problems with established solutions. The panic rising in my throat is an unwelcome, unprofessional anomaly. I push it down, replacing it with the cold logic that has kept me alive and prosperous in this line of work. "Hold still," I command, my voice sharper than intended. Rain doesn't respond, his limbs jerking in a violent, syncopated rhythm. His jaw is locked, teeth grinding with an audible crunch. This is inefficient, messy. He's going to damage himself, and more importantly, my floor. I glide over to the instrument tray and retrieve a neural dampener. It's a simple tool designed to emit a targeted frequency that temporarily suppresses motor neuron activity. I've used it 1,000 times to calm twitchy clients or prep for delicate spinal work. Pressing the activation stud, I aim the emitter at Rain's temple, expecting the usual result: a gradual relaxation of the muscles, a slackening of his limbs. Instead, the moment the frequency touches him, he arches his back with an inhuman scream. It's a sound that doesn't just pierce the air, it feels like it's scraping against the inside of my skull. A full-blown seizure. The bioluminescence under his skin flares, pulsing violently in time with his convulsions. This isn't a rejection. This is an acceleration. "Damn it," I hiss, dropping the useless dampener. Plan B, a direct diagnostic scan to identify the aberrant signal. I grab my handheld laser, a precision instrument capable of reading cellular composition from a distance. Setting it to a low-intensity tissue scan, I point the beam at his convulsing torso. The projected targeting grid shimmers on his chest. But instead of the soft hum of data acquisition, the laser emits a high-pitched ping, deflecting off his skin as if it were polished steel. An error message flashes on the laser's microdisplay. Density exceeds scanning parameters. My blood runs cold. I watch in disbelief as the patch of skin under the targeting grid cools from the laser's touch, not burning or even pinkening, but hardening. It shifts from translucent to opaque, taking on the glossy white sheen of fired ceramic. His flesh is changing states. Before I can process the sheer impossibility of it, the real horror begins. The ceramic-like patch on his chest develops a network of hairline cracks. The gurgling in his throat stops, replaced by a wet, percussive ticking from within his rib cage. The light beneath his skin concentrates in his torso, a sickeningly bright internal sun. I take an involuntary step back, my medical mind completely paralyzed by a primordial instinct to flee. There is a sound like splintering bone and tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. Rain's chest ruptures. Not an explosion of blood and viscera in the way a gunshot would cause, but a blossoming outward. Shards of the hardened skin and bone fly across the room like shrapnel clattering against the far wall. From the gaping, steaming cavity where his heart and lungs should be, a shower of gelatinous, amber-colored viscera and thick, coppery fluid erupts, spattering my sterile floor, my instrument trays, my boots. The convulsions stop. Rain's mangled corpse lies still. In the sudden ringing silence, I can only stare at the carnage. My clinic, my sanctuary of cold, predictable order, is now a charnel house. And on my pristine floor, amidst the gore and the shattered remains of a man, lies something else. A quivering, pearlescent sac, pulsating with a soft, rhythmic light of its own. The voice was already poison. Shock is a luxury I can't afford. My training, the cold and ruthless part of my brain that calculates risk and minimizes exposure, reasserts control. The sight of the pulsating sac on my floor is an aberration, a biological nightmare, but the primary threat is informational. Rain is a link back to me, a link that must be severed. My movements become clipped, efficient. First, the body. The incinerator is in the disposal bay, powerful enough to turn reinforced plasteel to ash. Flesh and bone would be no problem. I pull on a heavy-duty hazmat apron, the slick polymer resisting the spatter of gore as I approach the corpse. The air is thick with the coppery tang of blood and a strange acrid scent like burnt sugar and ozone. I try not to look at the ruptured cavity, at the unidentifiable gelatinous mess still clinging to the edges of the wound. Before dealing with the biological mess, I need to wipe the digital trail. Every client visit is logged in my encrypted local server, a triple redundant system designed to be ghosted at a moment's notice. I stride over to my main console, ignoring the squelch of my boots on the gore-slicked floor. My fingers fly across the holographic interface, pulling up Rain's file, installation date, payment record, the batch number for his Ythar filter. I initiate the Scorched Earth protocol. The system hesitates. Instead of the familiar cascade of deleting code, the screen flickers. For a single, jarring second, the standard alphanumeric interface is replaced by a glyph. It's an impossible shape, all non-Euclidean angles and intersecting curves that seem to shift as I try to focus on them. It looks less like a character and more like a diagram of a creature that shouldn't exist. Then, just as quickly, it's gone. Red alert icons blossom across my screen. A new window, stark and severe, dominates the display. External biometric threat detected. Security protocol, incubator's curse engaged. System lockdown initiated. My stomach drops into my boots. No, I whisper, turning toward the clinic's entrance. That's a deep-level failsafe, a manufacturer's protocol from the company that built this high-security bunker. A dead man's switch I never bothered to disable. A low, grinding groan fills the room, vibrating through the floor and up my legs. The clinic's main blast door, the one Rain forced his way through, begins to slide shut. Heavy locking pistons, each as thick as my arm, emerge from the walls with deafening hisses of pneumatic pressure, slamming home one by one. Clang, clang, clang. The final thud is a sound of absolute finality. A judge's gavel sentencing me to this sterile tomb. I lunge for the manual override panel near the door, my hand slipping on the controls. It's dead. No power. The entire security grid is offline, locked down by a protocol I don't even have clearance for. I slam my fist against the unyielding metal, the impact jarring my arm to the shoulder. I am sealed in, trapped. My breath hitches, the first ragged edge of true panic tearing through my professional facade. My gaze snaps back to the main console. The other warnings are gone, replaced by a single, chilling message, blinking in time with the soft, sickening pulse of the organic sack lying in the middle of Rain's eviscerated corpse. Incubation in progress. And in the oppressive, sudden silence of my sealed clinic, I realize with a cold, sinking certainty that the message isn't for the system. It's for me. The silence in a sealed tomb is a different kind of quiet. It presses in, amplifying the sound of your own blood rushing in your ears, the ragged rhythm of your breath. My prison was sterile, chromed, and now it was a crime scene with a single suspect, a single victim, and me. Desperation is a powerful catalyst. It strips away squeamishness and leaves only the raw, urgent need for answers. The answer, I knew, had to be in him, or what was left of him. With the primary incinerator offline due to the lockdown, I had to resort to my surgical tools. It was a grim, painstaking process. I worked under the focused beam of my overhead lamp, the rest of the clinic cast in shadow. The air was still thick with that cloying, alien smell. Using a vibroscalpel and bone shears, I cut through the back of Rain's neck, exposing the upper cervical vertebrae. The ceramic-like quality of his skin was less pronounced here, but the tissue was unnaturally rigid. There, fused to his spinal cord like a cancerous growth, was the Yuthar sensory filter. It was no longer the sleek obsidian sliver I had implanted. Its surface was now veined with a faint, pulsing lattice of the same bioluminescent fibers I'd seen under his skin. It felt warm to the touch. With a final, sickening crack of bone, I pried it free with a set of heavy forceps. It came away with a web of translucent, nerve-like tendrils that clung stubbornly to Rain's spinal column. I carried the corrupted device over to my diagnostic rig, my heart hammering against my ribs. The main network was down, but my analysis station had an independent power source. I gingerly placed the filter into the induction reader, connecting its data port with a microfilament probe. My fingers were slick with a mixture of my own sweat and Rain's strangely viscous fluids. The moment the connection was made, the rig's screen lit up. But there were no technical schematics, no performance metrics, no lines of elegant code. There was only a torrent of biological data, scrolling past faster than I could read. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a scripture, a genetic codex. I rerouted the feed through a translation matrix, letting my system parse the raw biocode into something I could understand. The results began to populate the screen, and with each translated line, the clinical dread in my chest solidified into icy horror. The filter was a deception. It wasn't a piece of technology. It was a seed, a parasitic vector disguised as a high-end sensory upgrade. The data laid it all out with horrifying clarity. Phase 1. Symbiosis. The parasite latches to the host's central nervous system, slowly rewriting the host's DNA, priming the body for metamorphosis. Phase 2. Gestation. The host's tissues are broken down and resequenced at a cellular level, turning the body into a living incubator. The final phase, the one that triggered the lockdown protocol, was designated hatching. Hubris. I had peddled transcendence without once questioning the source, blinded by the elegance of the design and the size of the profit margin. I sank into my chair, the strength leaving my legs. The text on the screen blurred, the alien diagram swimming before my eyes. And then, a thought, a small, cold splinter of a memory, lodged itself in my brain. A week ago, a new shipment had arrived. The quality of this batch seemed exceptional, more refined. For quality control, and perhaps a flicker of that same desire for enhancement I so despised in my clients, I had installed a sample unit. Just a quick, sterile procedure, no big deal. Slowly, as if it belonged to someone else, my hand rose to the back of my own neck. My fingers traced the faint, hair-thin scar at the base of my skull. And beneath the skin, I felt it. A dull, familiar ache I had dismissed as muscle strain. The codex wasn't just on my screen anymore. It was in my marrow. The ache in my neck was no longer a dull, ignorable thrum. It had sharpened into a distinct, phantom tingling, a constant reminder of the foreign body fused to my spine. My professional detachment, the cold wall of logic I had built around myself, was crumbling brick by brick. First, it had been an external threat, a problem to be solved and sanitized. Now, the contamination was inside. The lab and the specimen were one and the same. My senses began to betray me in subtle, terrifying ways. The air from the recycler, once just a neutral hiss of processed oxygen, now carried a distinct, metallic taste, the sharp tang of ozone on my tongue. The low hum of the backup generator was no longer just a sound. I could feel its vibration in my bones, a resonant frequency that seemed to shake me from the inside out. I stood perfectly still in the center of my ruined clinic, and it felt as if I were a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. The synesthesia Cygnus had described with such childlike wonder was now a symptom of my own looming violation. Paranoia, a hot and sticky presence, began to cloud my thoughts. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision would make me whip my head around, only to see the grotesque shadow cast by Rain's sheet-covered corpse. Was that a sound from the vents, or just the settling of the building? Was the dimming of the emergency lights a power fluctuation, or was it draining energy from the systems? "It knows," a thought whispered, unbidden, from the dark corners of my mind. The voice was my own, yet it felt alien, an intrusive echo. It felt the scan. It knows you know. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to squeeze the thought out, but it clung like a fever. The parasite, the seed, wasn't a passive implant waiting for a biological trigger. It was aware. It was an intelligence of a kind, a patient predator that had felt my mind brush against its nature when I hooked its severed sibling to the diagnostic rig. The tingling in my neck intensified, and for a terrifying moment I felt a ghost of a sensation, not my own, of curiosity, an ancient predatory inquisitiveness directed at me. My thoughts, my fears, my desperate calculations for survival were no longer private. They were data being passively observed by the entity nested in my own nervous system. My own body had become the hunting ground. I was no longer the surgeon, the master of this sterile domain. I was the enclosure, and something else was stalking the corridors of my veins and the pathways of my mind. I paced the length of the clinic, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. I ran a dozen frantic scenarios. Could I perform the surgery on myself? Impossible. Removing a spinal graft requires complete immobility and precision beyond the scope of a single unassisted surgeon, especially when the patient and practitioner are the same panicked man. A chemical purge? I had no idea what compounds would affect it without liquefying my own nervous system in the process. Every potential solution led to a dead end, and with each failure, the tingling in my neck pulsed a little stronger, a little warmer. It felt like a chuckle. The flashes of paranoia were becoming more vivid, blooming into full-blown auditory hallucinations. The soft, wet sound of something squirming just at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't just in my flesh anymore. It was in my head, and it was starting to feel comfortable. The hunter was making itself at home. Panic is a cold fire. It burns away all the complex, elegant solutions and leaves behind only the most primal, desperate instincts. My mind, a frantic rat in a cage of my own design, scurried through every inventory list, every hidden compartment, every contingency I had ever planned for. I had tools for cutting, stitching, and killing on a biological level. But this thing felt different. It was part tech, part biology, and all nightmare. If I couldn't cut it out, perhaps I could burn it out, electrically. The thought hit me like a jolt of pure adrenaline. The charger. In the far corner of my storage vault, behind shelves of legitimate medical supplies and illegal combat stimulants, was my final, brute force failsafe. It was a military-grade electromagnetic pulse charger, a black market monster I'd acquired years ago as insurance against a corporate security raid. It was designed to do one thing: emit a single violent burst of energy powerful enough to fry every active electronic circuit in a 50-meter radius. Computers, surveillance systems, cybernetic implants, all would be reduced to inert slag. It was my break glass in case of apocalypse. This qualified. I keyed in the manual override for the vault, the thick steel door hissing open. The air inside was cool and still. I pushed past sterile containers of cloned tissue and racks of surgical tools until I reached the back. There it was, sitting in a padded, lead-lined case, a matte black cylinder about the size of a fire extinguisher, bristling with heat sinks and thick, braided cables leading to a terrifyingly simple interface. A single covered toggle switch and a red activation button. Lugging the device out into the main clinic felt like carrying my own salvation. It was heavy, dense with capacitors and rare earth magnets. Its sheer physical weight was grounding, a tangible solution in a world that had dissolved into biological horror. My trembling hands fumbled with the clasps on the case. Rain's covered corpse lay a few meters away, a silent, grim reminder of what I was trying to avoid. The whispers at the edge of my hearing grew more agitated, a chorus of faint, static-laced hisses. The tingling in my neck had become a hot, itching throb. It was fighting me. The parasite understood intent. It knew what this machine represented. The thought was terrifying, but also validating. If it was afraid, it could be killed. I positioned the EMP charger in the center of the room. The plan was simple, savage, and deeply appealing. The Yarthar filter, even this biological perversion of it, had to have some kind of technological component to interface with the host's brain. A governor, a regulator, something to manage the initial sensory input. If I could overload that component, fry its delicate systems, I could kill the parasite at its source. It would destroy my clinic, every expensive piece of equipment I owned. But my life was worth more than the chrome and circuits I'd surrounded myself with. With a deep, shuddering breath, I flipped the protective cover off the toggle switch. The device powered on with a rising high-frequency whine, the sound of 1,000,000 volts being gathered for a single thunderous scream. A small green light next to the activation button began to blink. It was armed. For the first time since rain had collapsed on my floor, a surge of raw, unadulterated hope coursed through me. I was no longer the cornered specimen. I was the doctor again, holding the tool of excision. It was a crude, indiscriminate scalpel, but it was a scalpel nonetheless. I gripped the charger, my thumb hovering over the red button, and for a fleeting moment, I was back in control. I had a weapon. My thumb slammed down on the red activation button. The world did not explode. It simply stopped. The rising whine of the EMP charger peaked and then vanished into a thunderous crack that seemed to split the very air. For an infinitesimal fraction of a second, a brilliant blue-white light bleached all color from the room, etching the shadows of my equipment onto the walls. The emergency lights overhead popped like flashbulbs, showering the floor in tiny fragments of glass. Every monitor, every diagnostic rig, every powered system in my clinic sparked, fizzled, and died in a final, pathetic gasp of ozone and smoke. Then, absolute darkness, absolute silence. But the feeling in my neck did not stop. It did not die. It erupted. A searing, white-hot agony tore through my spine, a pain so profound it was beyond sound. I couldn't even scream. The signal from my brain to my lungs was lost in a supernova of pure neurological fire. My vision flickered, not with light, but with jagged, geometric patterns of non-color. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor, my head striking the cold metal with a dull thud. In that silent, pitch-black agony, the horrifying truth revealed itself. My assumption had been my downfall. I had viewed the problem through the lens of my trade, a flawed interface between man and machine. But there was no machine. The Ythar filter was a biological key, nothing more. A Trojan horse built of proteins and tailored DNA. It had no delicate electronics to fry, no circuits to overload. It was purely, horrifyingly organic. The EMP blast hadn't killed it. It had done something far, far worse. The faint technological residue in the implant, the subtle governors and inhibitors that perhaps kept the parasite's growth in a controlled symbiotic state, were the only things the pulse had affected. I had severed its leash. I had triggered an aggressive, untethered metamorphosis. A series of violent shudders racked my body. From the far side of the clinic, a single, battered emergency light, powered by its own primitive chemical battery, flickered to life. Its weak, strobing red beam cut a pathetic swath through the darkness, casting the room in hellish, pulsing tones of crimson and black. In that flickering, apocalyptic light, I raised a trembling hand to my own face. The pain in my neck began to subside, replaced by a sickening, cellular humming. My skin, it was shimmering. I stared at the back of my hand, my surgeon's hand, and watched in abject terror as the flesh began to lose its opacity. It was thinning, becoming translucent, just like Rain's had. Beneath the surface, I could see the dark outlines of my own bones, the delicate network of my veins. And in those veins, my blood was beginning to glow with a faint, internal, bioluminescent light. The transformation was no longer a creeping threat. It was happening. It was happening to me now, in the ruins of my technological tomb. Stripped bare, that's what I was. My technology was a heap of smoking slag. My body was a traitorous vessel accelerating its own corruption. The alien thing at the base of my skull was no longer a subtle parasite. It was a conquering army, and the humming in my veins was its victory march. Panic gave way to a chilling, diamond-hard clarity. If the tools of my trade couldn't save me, I would have to turn the trade against myself. My knowledge of the human body, of its frailties and its limits, was my only remaining weapon. I couldn't surgically remove the parasite while conscious. It was fused to my brainstem. The slightest tremor, the slightest miscalculation, and I'd sever my own spinal cord. It would fight me, using my own motor functions against me. But what if the body it inhabited was no longer an asset? What if I could make my flesh an inhospitable environment? An idea, insane and terrifyingly logical, took root in the last sovereign corner of my mind. Clinical death. The parasite needed a living host. Its entire life cycle, as detailed on my now-dead diagnostic rig, was predicated on rewriting a living system. If the host system shut down, if the heart stopped, if the brain ceased receiving oxygen, it would perceive an imminent threat to its own existence. A dying ship is no place for a pilot. It might detach. It might uncoil from my spine in a desperate act of self-preservation, attempting to exit the dying host. That would be my window. A few seconds of cardiac arrest, an eternity on a razor's edge. I'd have just enough time, with my body shutting down, to reach in and physically rip the damned thing out. Then, the restart, a direct intracardiac injection of adrenaline. It was a brutal, crude maneuver, the medical equivalent of hitting a dead machine with a hammer. There was a 90% chance it would kill me, but doing nothing offered a 100% chance of something far worse than death. Hope, this time, was not a surge of power, but a cold, grim resolve. I stumbled through the flickering red darkness, my translucent hand leaving glowing streaks in my vision. I kicked aside the useless husk of the EMP charger and made my way to my private medical locker, a hardened plasteel case with a simple mechanical lock. My fingers, clumsy and thick with the parasite's changes, fumbled with the combination. Inside, nestled in sterile foam, were the tools of my final, desperate surgery. 2 syringes, one filled with tetrodotoxin 8, a potent, fast-acting neurotoxin I kept for unsanctioned assassinations, a service I rarely offered but charged a fortune for. It would stop my heart in under 10 seconds. The second syringe was filled with a high-dose adrenaline cocktail. The needle, a thick 3-inch spike designed for punching through the sternum. I laid them out on a clean metal tray, their contents seeming to glow in the pulsating emergency light. The finality of the choice settled over me, heavy as a burial shroud. I was about to kill myself to save my life. The surgeon, the patient, and the executioner, all embodied in one trembling, translucent form. The clinic had become a stage for a gruesome one-man play. In the strobing, bloody light of the single emergency lamp, I laid out my instruments with a meticulousness that bordered on madness. The neurotoxin syringe on the left, the adrenaline on the right. Between them, a sterile tray holding a razor-sharp scalpel and a pair of heavy-gauge forceps. Every object cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock my every move. The parasite was fully aware of my intent. The subtle hum in my veins had escalated into a psychic roar. It wasn't just influencing my senses now. It was actively fighting for control. Whispers slithered through my mind, not at the edge of hearing, but directly between my ears. They sounded like rain, like Cygnus, like every client whose flesh I had ever carved. They screamed, they pleaded, they accused. Murderer, butcher, you did this to us. You did this to yourself. My hands, the source of my livelihood and my pride, began to tremble violently. They were a surgeon's hands, trained for microscopic precision, capable of stitching a nerve fiber without a single tremor. Now they shook with a palsy so severe I could barely hold the scalpel. The alien will coiled around my own, flooding my motor cortex with contradictory signals, trying to make me drop the tools, to slash my own wrists, to give in. No, I gritted out, the word a ragged croak in the cavernous silence. I gripped my right wrist with my left hand, using bone and muscle to brace against the unnatural tremors. This became the new fight. Not a battle for survival in the abstract, but a war waged over inches of my own nervous system. My first task was the incision. I needed a clear path to the parasite, a pre-cut opening I could access the moment my body went limp. I craned my neck, using a shard of polished chrome from a shattered monitor as a crude mirror. The reflection was a monster's. My skin thin as oiled parchment, my eyes wide and glowing faintly from within. I could see the subtle bulge at the base of my skull where the thing was nested. Bringing the scalpel up was a monumental struggle. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening shriek of pure psychic terror. Its terror. It knew the blade. It knew what was coming. My arm jerked, and the tip of the scalpel skittered across the chrome shard, leaving a high-pitched scratch. I took a deep, shuddering breath, focusing all my remaining will on a single point, a single purpose. I pressed the ice-cold blade to my own flesh. The pain was clean, sharp, and blessedly mine. It cut through the phantom whispers for a precious second. I sliced downwards, creating a deep, 2-inch incision just to the side of my spine. Blood, thicker and darker than it should be, welled up instantly, glowing an obscene ruby in the red light. The tremors intensified. The forceps clattered against the metal tray as I tried to pick them up. I had to arrange my body for the final act. I laid down on my side, propped up on one elbow, the incision site exposed. I placed the waiting neurotoxin syringe by my chest and the forceps and adrenaline by my hand within easy, desperate reach. Each movement was a battle against an invisible current, a wrestling match with the ghost in my own machine. The surgeon's hands, my greatest asset, were now my greatest liability, trembling on the verge of total betrayal. With the scalpel discarded and my own blood slick on my fingers, I picked up the neurotoxin syringe. The liquid inside seemed to pulse with a malevolent darkness. This was the point of no return. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat counting down my final seconds of life. The whispers in my head became a single, coherent plea. Don't. Live. We can live. Not like this, I rasped, and jammed the needle into my thigh. I pushed the plunger down. The coldness spread through my veins with venomous speed. For a few seconds, nothing. My heart continued its frantic tattoo. Then, a shudder, a flutter. It missed a beat. Then another. The clinic's strobing red light seemed to slow down, dimming at the edges of my vision. A profound weakness washed over me, a leaden weight pulling my limbs toward the floor. My breath hitched. My vision tunneled into a single point of wavering red light. My world went black. But I was not gone. I was adrift. Trapped in a dying vessel, I could feel the last commands of my brain firing into unresponsive flesh. And in that terrifying limbo between life and death, I felt it, a grotesque, liberating tear. The parasite, sensing the catastrophic system failure of its host, uncoiled. It was a sensation of pure violation, like a tapeworm of fire being ripped from my spinal cord. The agony was immense, yet distant. It was happening to a corpse I was still tethered to. My arm, my hand, one last command. With a vestige of motor control that felt like dragging a mountain, my fingers closed around the cold steel of the forceps. The limb was clumsy, a dead thing animated by a final echo of will. I plunged the tool into the open, waiting incision in my neck. There was no pain, only a vague pressure. I fumbled in the blind, wet darkness of my own flesh, and then I felt it, a squirming, muscular mass. It was bigger, softer than I imagined. I clamped down. The forceps met resistance, then closed on the writhing thing. It pulsed violently, a final, desperate struggle. With the last dregs of my strength, I tore my hand back. The creature came free with a sickening, wet slorp, a sound that echoed in the void of my fading consciousness. My arm, its purpose fulfilled, fell limp. I slumped completely to the floor, my face pressed against the cold, blood-slicked metal. The adrenaline. My other hand, lying near my chest, spasmed. One more push, the greatest act of will in my entire life. My fingers brushed the second syringe, closed around it, guided it. The needle, thick and unforgiving, was aimed at the space between my ribs. I had no strength to push it gently. I could only clench my fist, slamming it against my own sternum. A starburst of pure, crystalline agony. The needle punched through skin, muscle, and cartilage, grating against bone. My fist spasmed again, pushing the plunger. The adrenaline hit my stalled heart like a bolt of lightning. The world exploded back into being, not with light, but with pain. Every nerve ending screamed at once. My heart, shocked back into action, gave a single convulsive lurch, then another, hammering against the needle still embedded in my chest. I took a gasping, retching breath that was half air, half blood. My eyes snapped open, seeing nothing but the strobing red light of a world I had, against all odds, returned to. Consciousness returned in waves, each one more painful than the last. My first sensation was the cold. The sterile metal floor was leaching the warmth from my body, a stark contrast to the fire raging in my chest where the adrenaline needle was still buried. I gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and tasted blood and ozone. The weak, steady hum of the backup generator, a low thrum that was blessedly, beautifully normal. With a groan that felt torn from the depths of my soul, I rolled onto my back. The movement sent a fresh explosion of agony through me. The world was a dizzying canvas of red and black from the strobing emergency light. I was alive. The thought was not triumphant, but simply declarative. A fact. I had stepped into the abyss and somehow crawled back out. My gaze fell upon the thing lying on the floor beside me, nestled in a pool of my own coagulated blood. It was a slug-like horror, about the size of my fist, a mass of twitching, pearlescent muscle and translucent tendrils. It spasmed weakly, its inner bioluminescence flickering and dying like a faulty light bulb. As I watched, it gave one final violent twitch, and then was still. The glow faded completely, leaving it a lump of dull, grayish meat. Dead. The most profound change, however, was not something I could see. It was the silence. The whispers were gone, the constant low-grade hum of paranoia, the feeling of being watched from the inside, the phantom tingling at the base of my skull, all of it had vanished. My mind was my own again. The sudden solitude was so absolute, so complete, that it was deafening. It was the sound of a prisoner so accustomed to the rattling of his chains, who is suddenly and inexplicably set free. The emptiness was staggering. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself into a sitting position. My body was a roadmap of torment. The deep, ragged wound in my neck gaped open, oozing sluggishly. My chest was a nexus of sharp, stabbing pain. But my hands were steady. With a trembling, blood-covered hand, I reached for the suturing kit I'd laid out an eternity ago. Threading the needle took 3 attempts, my vision still swimming. But then, instinct took over. The old, familiar motions, the practiced, rhythmic work of closing a wound. I pushed the needle through my own skin, the sharp sting a welcome, grounding sensation. I began to stitch the gaping hole in my neck closed. Each pull of the suture was a small, painstaking act of reclamation. Each knot was a testament, a defiant stitch against the cosmic horror that had tried to unmake me. I was not a host. I was not a vessel. I was a surgeon, and I was putting myself back together. The voice, the plan, the code, all playing out just as they had. Days melted into a blur of pain, exhaustion, and the quiet, steady work of healing. My clinic, once a pristine sanctuary, was now a tomb. The equipment was dead, silent husks of scorched metal and plastic. The body of rain, still under its sheet, was a constant, grim monument to my hubris. The darkness was broken only by the hum of the backup generator and the single, stubborn emergency light that refused to die. I was a ghost haunting my own grave. I stitched and bandaged myself, disinfected my ruined floor, and sealed Rain's remains in a stasis bag, the best I could do until I found a way out. The professional detachment I had cultivated for years had been burned out of me, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out space. I could still look at my own ravaged body with a clinician's eye, assessing tissue damage and nerve regeneration, but the cold objectivity was gone. I knew now that the flesh was not a machine. It was a fragile, permeable vessel, terrifyingly vulnerable to invasion. The scar on my neck was a constant, burning reminder. It was thick, keloid, and ugly. I would catch my reflection in a dark monitor screen and see a stranger staring back, a man with haunted eyes and a brand of survival etched into his skin. The silence in my head was no longer deafening. It had become a vast, empty space where fear could echo without opposition. I was contemplating the grim logistics of blasting my way through the locked door when a sound, small and almost forgotten, cut through the gloom. A faint, electronic beep, beep. It came from a dusty corner of my desk, a relic, an old, low-tech comms unit powered by a long-life battery that ran on an insulated, hard-line network separate from the clinic's main system. I kept it for untraceable dealings with smugglers and off-world contacts. I hadn't used it in years. I limped over to the desk and picked up the receiver. The small text screen glowed with a new message, its cheerful green font a jarring contrast to the ruin around me. My blood ran cold as I read the words. Client inquiry, Vine. Heard great things, top shelf. Yathar sensory filter. Heard it can make you hear light. What's your price, and how soon for install? I stared at the message, my hand tightening on the receiver until my knuckles were white. Out there, in the neon-drenched streets of the city above, the seed was still spreading. The story was still being told. Another fool, just like Cygnus, just like Rain, just like me, chasing a manufactured miracle. My survival, my agony, my descent into hell and back, it hadn't stopped anything. I had cut the infection from my own body, but the plague was still for sale on the open market, and I was still one of the few who had the key. The blinking cursor on the comm unit pulsed patiently, awaiting my reply.